She built $1 billion company from nothing. He fixes boats for a living. They had no reason to ever be in the same room. But tonight, at the most exclusive charity gala in the country, Claire Whitmore stopped breathing the moment she saw what was hanging around that stranger's neck. Her dead husband's dog tags. Tags the Navy told her were lost forever. Tags she had spent 6 years trying to forget existed. If you've ever lost someone and never got the closure you deserved, stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. And if it moves you, hit like before we're done. This is their story. 1. The invitation had come with a hand-embossed seal and a note that Ethan Mercer almost threw in the recycling bin. Veterans Community Service Award. Gala dinner. The Ashworth Grand, Washington, D.C. Black tie. He'd read it 3 times standing over the kitchen sink, still in his work clothes, smelling like marine grease and low tide. His daughter Maya was doing homework at the kitchen table, 7 years old and already more organized than he had ever been in his life. Her colored pencils arranged in a row by shade. "What's that?" she asked without looking up. "Something I probably won't go to." "Is it fancy?" "Very." She looked up then. "You should go. You never go anywhere." He almost argued. Instead, he folded the card and put it on the counter and let it sit there for 2 weeks. He went. But the Ashworth Grand was the kind of building that made you feel underdressed just walking past it on the sidewalk. Inside, it was worse. Chandeliers that probably cost more than his truck. Men in tuxedos that fit like they were born wearing them. Women in gowns that moved like water. The air smelled like something expensive. Not perfume exactly, just the combined scent of money and ambition and good catering. Ethan stood near the entrance with his single good jacket, navy blue, slightly too wide in the shoulders, bought for his sister's wedding 7 years ago, and tried to decide if there was a polite way to collect the award and leave before anyone noticed he didn't belong here. He'd worn the dog tags out of habit. He wore them every day, had for 6 years. Most days he didn't even feel their weight anymore. They sat against his chest under his shirt, warm from his skin. 2 small pieces of metal that had been with him longer than most people he knew. Tonight, for some reason he couldn't explain, he'd left them outside his collar. Maybe because it felt right to have them visible on a night meant to honor service. Maybe because he was tired of carrying things quietly. He'd been doing that for 6 years too. A man in an earpiece appeared and steered him toward a table near the side of the room, slightly removed from the main floor, which suited Ethan fine. He was given a glass of sparkling water and a menu he didn't read and left alone, which suited him even better. The room filled quickly. These were people who knew how to work a room, moving from cluster to cluster, laughing at the right moments, exchanging business cards like handshakes. Ethan watched them the way he used to watch an unfamiliar shoreline, reading the current, looking for where things moved differently than they should. He'd been a Navy SEAL for 9 years. He'd learned to read environments before he read people. This environment was saying, "You are not one of us." He already knew that. So, Claire Whitmore arrived 40 minutes after the doors opened, which was intentional. She had a rule about galas: never arrive early, never be the one waiting. It had nothing to do with status. It was about control. Early arrival meant standing around making small talk while your mind tried to stay present and your body just wanted to go home and take off the heels. Tonight's heels were black and unforgiving, and she'd worn them anyway because her deputy director of communications had laid them out with a note that said, "These are the ones," and Claire had learned over the years that her deputy director of communications was almost always right. She was 30 years old and had been running Whitmore Technologies for 3 years, the youngest CEO of any company on that particular Forbes list, which she'd been reminded of approximately 400 times since the issue came out. The company built data security infrastructure for federal contractors. Dry work, vital work, and she was genuinely good at it. Not because she was particularly brilliant, though she was competent, but because she worked harder than anyone around her and had zero patience for the kind of institutional complacency that let security vulnerabilities fester. She knew what happened when people stopped paying attention. 6 years ago, the Navy knocked on her door and told her that her husband, Lieutenant Commander Daniel Whitmore, had been killed during a classified operation. They told her he died serving his country. They told her his remains could not be recovered. They told her his personal effects, including the dog tags he wore, had been lost in the field and could not be returned to the family. They told her a lot of things softly and with genuine regret, and she had nodded and thanked them and waited until they were gone before she sat down on the kitchen floor and didn't get up for a very long time. She still didn't have a grave to visit. She had learned to live with that. Or rather, she had learned to live alongside it, the way you learn to live alongside a persistent, low-grade injury. It doesn't stop you, but you're always aware of it, always making small compensations you've stopped noticing you make. She crossed the ballroom with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this 100 times, smiling at faces she recognized, nodding at introductions, half listening to a senator's advisor talk about infrastructure investment, while her eyes did what they always did in crowded rooms, scanned, categorized, moved on. That was when she saw him. Not because he was handsome, though he wasn't hard to look at, not because he was out of place, though he obviously was, but because of what was hanging around his neck. 2 small metal tags on a beaded chain, resting against the outside of a navy blue jacket. Ordinary to anyone else. Claire had seen thousands of dog tags in her life, at fundraisers and military events, and the one terrible ceremony where she'd stood in a hangar and received a folded flag. But those weren't ordinary. She couldn't read the inscription from here. She couldn't even be certain. But the chain, the specific way that chain was linked, the slight difference in the size of the 2 tags, the way one sat slightly higher than the other, her brain had cataloged those details with the obsessive precision of grief, and now every alarm in her body was going off at once. She stopped walking. The senator's advisor kept talking. She didn't hear him. "Excuse me," she said, without looking at him, and moved across the room. Ethan was studying the breadbasket and trying to decide if he was actually hungry or just bored when he became aware that someone was standing very still, about 10 feet away, staring at him. He looked up. A woman. Dark hair. A dress that probably cost more than his boat engine, and an expression he couldn't immediately read. Not quite alarm, not quite recognition, something that sat between them in a way that made the back of his neck go tight. He'd seen that look before. Not often. Usually on people who just realized something they hadn't been prepared to realize. She crossed the remaining distance and stopped directly in front of him. Up close, she was younger than he'd expected from the posture alone, and her eyes, dark, sharp, were fixed on his chest with an intensity that told him, without any question, exactly what she was looking at. "Where did you get those?" she asked. Her voice was very level, the kind of level that was being maintained by effort. Ethan didn't move. "These are mine." "They're not." She said it without accusation, just fact, which was somehow worse. "Those are my husband's." The table next to them had gone quiet. A man in a tuxedo nearby was already reaching for his phone. Ethan felt the shift in the room the way he used to feel a change in wind direction. Small, but significant. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice low, "I think we need to have this conversation somewhere private." "I think," she said, "you need to tell me where you got those tags." He held her gaze. 6 years he'd been carrying this. 6 years of knowing that somewhere, a woman he'd never met was living with a version of the truth that was missing the most important part. He had wondered, more than once, what this moment would look like when it finally arrived. He hadn't imagined it would be here, under chandeliers, with a senator's advisor watching from 8 feet away. "I know who your husband was," he said quietly. "I know what happened to him, and I will tell you everything, but not here." Yet, it was the security team that complicated things. The head of venue security, a broad man named Greer, who had the professional paranoia of someone who'd managed too many events where something went sideways, appeared at Claire's elbow within 90 seconds. Apparently, someone had already flagged a potential confrontation involving a gala guest and an unknown male who was possibly in possession of stolen military property. 3 additional security staff positioned themselves around the table. Ethan sat very still and let it happen, which was the thing that surprised Claire most. A man being surrounded by security in front of 200 wealthy guests had approximately 0 comfortable options. Most people would get loud or defensive or start explaining. Ethan did none of those things. He put his hands flat on the table where everyone could see them and waited, with a quality of stillness that felt less like submission and more like a man deciding not to spend energy on something he considered beneath the current situation. Sir, I'm going to need to ask you to come with us, Greer said. I'm fine right here, Ethan said pleasantly. Sir? He's not going anywhere. Claire said it before she'd fully decided to, but once it was out, she didn't walk it back. She turned to Greer. I know who this is. She didn't, actually, but she knew what she'd seen in his face when he said, I know who your husband was. That wasn't the face of someone who'd stolen something. That was the face of someone who'd been holding something too long. Greer looked uncertain, the guests who'd been watching. And there were more of them now, the subtle crowd pull of potential drama in a room full of people who spent their professional lives managing it, had gone very quiet. Ms. Whitmore, Greer tried again. Give us the room, she said. Then, because that was not actually possible in the middle of a charity gala. Give us a room. There's a private dining space off the East Hall. I need 10 minutes. The private dining room held a table for 12 and smelled like fresh flowers that weren't there. Claire closed the door herself. 2 of Greer's staff remained outside. She didn't argue about that. She and Ethan sat across from each other at one end of the long table. He'd accepted a glass of water and set it down without drinking. She'd accepted nothing. Start talking, she said. He looked at her for a moment, not sizing her up exactly, more like he was deciding where to begin, the way someone decides where to pick up a tangled line. My name is Ethan Mercer. I served with Daniel for 2 years. Last assignment, same team. I got out about 8 months before. He stopped, started again. Before the operation. Which operation? I can't name it. I won't ever be able to name it. You probably know that. She did. She'd spent the better part of a year trying to find out exactly what Daniel had been doing when he died, and had run into the same classified wall every time. She knew how to accept information she couldn't verify. Keep going, she said. I came back in for that mission, temporary assignment. There were 6 of us. He turned the water glass slowly without picking it up. Things went wrong. The way things sometimes go wrong when you're 60 miles behind where you should be and the evac window is closing. At a certain point, he paused again. Not for effect, like he was picking the words from somewhere careful. At a certain point, it became clear that not everyone was going to make the same helicopter. The room was very quiet. Outside, muted conversation and the sound of a live band drifted under the door, impossibly distant. Daniel was the senior officer, Ethan continued. He made a call. It wasn't... His jaw tightened slightly. It wasn't the call I would have made if I'd been the one making it. What was the call? He met her eyes. He put me on the helicopter. Claire stared at him. He had reasons, Ethan said. Good ones, by his logic. I'd just become a father. My daughter was 8 months old. Her mother had died in a car accident 2 months before that mission, which meant if I didn't come home, Maya had nobody. He exhaled slowly through his nose. Daniel knew that. He also knew, I think he'd already decided before we were even in that position, that if it came down to a choice, he wasn't going to let me be the one to stay behind. He ordered you onto the helicopter. He ordered me. Yes. And you went. Something crossed his face. It was fast, but she caught it. I went. I've had 6 years to sit with that. Claire was quiet for a long moment. The band outside shifted into something softer. She became aware that her hands were folded very tightly in her lap and made a deliberate effort to relax them. The dog tags, she said. Before I got on the helicopter, Ethan said, he took them off and put them in my hand. He told me... He stopped, looked at the table. He told me to find you, someday, when it felt right. He said he didn't want the last thing you knew about him to be that he was lost. He reached up and lifted the chain over his head, set it on the table between them. Claire didn't touch it. He said he made his choice, Ethan said. Not because he had a death wish, not because he didn't want to come home to you, but because he knew what he was choosing for. He wanted you to know that. He wanted you to hear it from someone who was there. She looked at the dog tags for a long time. Then she looked at him. Why did you wait 6 years? It was a fair question, and she asked it without accusation, though there was weight behind it. Ethan didn't flinch from it, because I didn't know how. He said it simply, without dressing it up. Because every time I thought I'd found the right way to walk up to a widow and tell her what I just told you, It felt like the wrong way. Because I had a baby daughter and I was drowning and I kept telling myself I'd do it when things settled down. A pause. Things don't settle down. I just eventually stopped using that as an excuse. Claire sat back in her chair. Outside, someone laughed at something. A clean, uncomplicated sound that felt like it was coming from a different world. "You came here tonight to receive an award," she said. "I came here," Ethan said, "because a man I owed a debt to deserved to have someone show up for him, even late." She didn't say anything for a while. Then, "His name was Daniel James Whitmore. He liked bad coffee and terrible detective novels, and he cried at sports documentaries and thought no one noticed." Her voice was steady. "Not quite." "He was 32 years old." Ethan nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "He talked about you, not—" He stopped, reconsidered. He didn't go into detail. He wasn't that kind of person, but he talked about you the way some people talk about home. She looked away, not to hide anything, just to look somewhere that wasn't directly at this man who had sat with her husband's last words for 6 years and carried them like cargo. When she looked back, her expression had shifted into something that hadn't been there before. Not softness exactly, but the particular steadiness of someone who has just received something painful and true and is deciding what to do with it. "My security team," she said, "is going to want to verify everything you just told me." "I know. I have documentation, some of it. The classified parts, you'll need someone with clearance to unlock." He paused. "I know a retired admiral who can make some calls." She almost laughed. It surprised her. "Of course you do," she said. He didn't smile, but something around his eyes changed fractionally. Outside, the gala went on, glasses clinking, conversations rising and falling. 200 people who had no idea that in a private dining room off the East Hall, something that had been broken for 6 years had just quietly begun to be put back together. Claire Whitmore looked at the dog tags on the table between them. She did not pick them up. Not yet. That would come later, when she knew what it meant. For now, she just let them sit there, small, ordinary, impossibly heavy, and breathed. Greer knocked on the door at the 11-minute mark, which told Claire he'd been standing outside counting. She said, "1 more minute," through the door, and meant closer to 5. And when she finally emerged into the corridor with Ethan behind her, the security chief had the carefully neutral expression of a man trying very hard not to have opinions about things that were above his pay grade. "Everything all right, Miss Whitmore?" "Fine," she said. "Mr. Mercer is a guest. He stays." Greer looked at Ethan the way men in his profession looked at variables they hadn't accounted for. "Yes, ma'am." They walked back into the gala. The band had shifted to something instrumental and unhurried. Most of the guests had moved to their tables for the first course, which meant fewer people standing around with nothing to do but watch. Claire was aware of eyes on her anyway. She was always aware of eyes on her at these things. But the specific quality of attention had changed. Before, it had been the ordinary attention of a room acknowledging its most prominent guest. Now it had a question in it. She didn't answer questions she hadn't been asked yet. That was a rule she lived by. She steered them toward her table, which seated 8 and currently held 7 people. Her deputy director of communications, 2 board members from the gala committee, a senior partner from her firm's outside counsel, and 3 people she knew well enough to place but not well enough to fully trust. They all looked up when she arrived, and then they all looked at Ethan, and the specific sequence of expressions that followed, polite inquiry shading into confusion, shading into carefully managed neutrality, was something Claire had seen enough times that she could read it like a weather forecast. "This is Ethan Mercer," she said. "He's receiving the Veterans Service Award tonight. Please make room." Someone made room. Ethan sat. He looked at the table settings for a moment, the spread of cutlery, the 3 glasses of varying sizes, with the expression of a man running a quick inventory. Not intimidated, just making sure he knew what he was walking into. That quality in him, the steady, unbothered assessment of unfamiliar terrain, kept catching her attention. She'd met plenty of people who projected calm. Ethan didn't project it. He just had it, the way certain structures have load-bearing walls that don't announce themselves. Her deputy director, James, leaned slightly toward her and said under his breath, Do you want to tell me what just happened in the East Hall, or are we doing the thing where I find out from someone else tomorrow morning? Tomorrow morning, she said. He accepted this with the resignation of a man who had learned when to ask. Oh. The award ceremony happened at 9:15. A retired general read a brief citation. Community outreach, youth mentorship, 14 years of volunteer work with a veterans transition organization in Annapolis. And Ethan walked to the small stage at the front of the room and accepted a framed certificate and a handshake. He said thank you into the microphone. He said he was glad to be there. He said the work wasn't his alone and named 3 other people from the organization, which made the MC look mildly unprepared, and then he walked back to his seat. It took under 4 minutes. He sat back down and pushed the framed certificate slightly to the side to make room for his water glass. Short speech, said the board member to his left, a man named Hutchins, who had the hearty, slightly aggressive sociability of someone who had made his money in commercial real estate and never entirely let you forget it. I said what needed saying, Ethan replied, and turned his attention back to his food. Hutchins looked at Claire with raised eyebrows. Claire kept her face neutral. She watched Ethan eat, not conspicuously. She had more social control than that, but she was aware of him in the particular way you become aware of a thing you've just been handed and don't yet know what to do with. He ate like a man who didn't have complicated feelings about food, which was to say he ate methodically and without comment and finished most of what was on his plate. He refilled his own water glass twice and didn't touch the wine. She noticed the dog tags were back under his collar. She'd done that. She realized it now. In the private dining room, somewhere in the middle of the silence after he'd said he talked about you the way some people talk about home. She'd looked away, and when she'd looked back, she'd noticed, without really processing it, that he'd lifted the chain back over his head. He'd put them away. Not hidden them. She understood the distinction. Just returned them to where they lived. The way you'd return a borrowed thing to its place out of respect rather than convenience. She was going to have to figure out what to do with all of this. But not tonight. Tonight required getting through the rest of the evening without her expression doing anything she'd have to explain to a room full of people who tracked her face for a living. The gala wound down by 10:30. People who had early flights shook hands and kissed cheeks and filtered toward the exits. The band packed up. The catering staff moved through the room with the quiet efficiency of people who'd done this 1,000 times and wanted to be done with this particular instance of it. Claire found Ethan near the coat check, his jacket on, the framed certificate under his arm. He was looking at his phone, something brief, the way you glance at a phone when you're checking the time, not really reading anything. Do you have a car? She asked. Rideshare. It's about 4 minutes out. She looked at him. He looked at her. The room was thinning around them, voices getting farther away. I need you to come back tomorrow, she said. Not here, my office. I'm going to have some people I trust verify what you've told me, and I need you present for that. All right. It's not. She stopped, started over. I believe you. I want to be clear about that. This isn't about doubting your account. It's about making sure I have the complete picture before I decide what to do with it. He nodded slowly, not hurt by the caveat. That's fair. My assistant will send you the address in time. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a business card that looked like it had been in there for a while, slightly soft at the corners, the print simple and spare. Mercer Marine, Boat Repair and Restoration, Annapolis, Maryland. A phone number. No website. She took it. You drove up from Annapolis tonight? Left at 4:30. I had a neighbor watch Maya. Your daughter? Yeah. She looked at the card for a moment, then she looked at him. How old is she now? Something shifted in his face. A small thing, like a window opening a crack. 7. She'll be 8 in March. Which meant she'd been 8 months old when Daniel put Ethan on that helicopter. Which meant she had never known a world where her father might not have come home from that particular mission. She had only the world that existed because Daniel Whitmore had made one specific choice and then handed this man a pair of dog tags and told him to find a woman he'd never met. Claire was very practiced at not letting her face do things she didn't want it to do. I'll see you tomorrow, she said. I'll be there, he said. His rideshare arrived and he left, and Claire stood in the thinning lobby of the Ashworth Grand and held a slightly worn business card and tried to figure out if she was more shaken than she'd realized or exactly as shaken as she'd realized and had simply been managing it well. Probably the second one. She was good at managing things. The managing always caught up with you eventually, but you could usually hold it off until you were somewhere private. She made it to the car. She made it to the hotel. She made it to the room, and she sat down on the edge of the bed without turning on more than the bedside lamp, and she held it together for approximately 45 more seconds before it didn't hold anymore. And then she sat there in the half-dark and let herself feel the specific, gutting, complicated weight of being told, 6 years late, that your husband died knowing exactly what he was dying for. It wasn't closure. She'd long since stopped believing in closure as a concept. But it was something, a shape where there had been only absence, a sentence where there had been only silence. She cried for a while, not prettily. She never cried prettily, and she'd stopped trying. Then she washed her face and went to sleep. The offices of Whitmore Technologies occupied the top 3 floors of a building in downtown D.C. that had been renovated recently enough to look modern, but not so recently that it looked like it was trying. Claire's office was on the top floor, corner-facing, with a view of the city that she had stopped noticing about 18 months into the job because she was almost never looking out windows. She arrived at 7:15, which was normal. James arrived at 7:30, which was also normal. And within 5 minutes of sitting down at his desk outside her office, he appeared in her doorway with the expression he reserved for things he needed to be briefed on immediately. "The gala," he said. "Sit down." He sat. She told him as much as she needed him to know. The dog tags, Ethan's identity, the bare outline of what had been said in the private dining room. She didn't tell him the part about sitting on the hotel bed and crying. That wasn't relevant to operations. James listened without interrupting, which was one of his better qualities. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to reach out to Admiral Carver's office. Retired. He'll know why I'm calling if you use Daniel's name. I also need someone to run a basic background on Ethan Mercer. Nothing invasive, just service record, discharge status, current situation. And I need you to clear 2 hours from my schedule this afternoon." Done. And he checked his phone. "You have the infrastructure committee call at 2. Move it. They're not going to love that. They'll survive." He stood up, paused at the door. "Claire." She looked at him. He seemed to be choosing his words with some care, which meant he was about to say something he wasn't sure she wanted to hear. "Are you okay?" "I'm functional," she said. He accepted this as the most honest answer available and left. 10. Ethan arrived at 1:50, 10 minutes early, which she'd expected. He was in different clothes, dark pants, a plain gray button-down, clean work boots. And he looked like a man who owned exactly one version of dressed up and had deployed it consciously without apology. James showed him to the conference room adjacent to Claire's office. She came in 2 minutes later with a legal pad, a cup of coffee she'd already mostly finished, and the retired admiral. Not in person. On a laptop screen propped at the head of the table. Admiral Frank Carver, 71, had retired 8 years ago after 34 years of naval service and now lived on a small property in coastal Virginia and apparently had no objection to video calls on short notice when the right name was mentioned. He had a face like weathered mahogany and the economical speech patterns of someone who had spent decades saying important things to people who needed to hear them clearly on the first try. He looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at him. "Chief Petty Officer Mercer," the Admiral said. "Admiral Carver." A pause. "It's been a while, sir?" 10 years, give or take. You look tired." "I run a boat repair shop and I'm raising a 7-year-old solo. I'm always tired." Something moved in Carver's expression that might have been the closest he came to amused. "Ms. Whitmore tells me you were at the gala last night." "Yes, sir." "And you'd like me to verify your identity and service record and confirm the circumstances of the operation in question." "As much as you can confirm." Ethan said it without pressure. "I know how much of it you can actually talk about." "More than I could 10 years ago," Carver said evenly. "Parts of that mission were declassified 2 years ago. Not publicly, but the family restriction on certain information was lifted." He paused. "Ms. Whitmore was never notified of that, because the Navy, in its infinite administrative efficiency, apparently sent the notification to an address she'd moved from." He said this with the tone of a man who had personally expressed displeasure about exactly this kind of failure and had been politely ignored. Claire kept her expression level. She had not known that. She would have several things to say about it later, but later was not now. "Let's start with your service record," she said. What followed was 40 minutes of the most precise, detailed, and at times quietly painful conversation Claire had ever sat through in a professional context. Carver confirmed Ethan's identity, his SEAL designation, his temporary reassignment to the unit that included Daniel for the mission in question. He confirmed the broad strokes of what had gone wrong: insertion complications, altered extraction window, a tactical situation that had forced a command decision under extreme time pressure with no good options on the table. He confirmed that Lieutenant Commander Daniel Whitmore had remained behind to provide cover for the evacuation of 6 civilians and 4 team members, and had died in the field approximately 37 minutes after the helicopter departed. He confirmed that the dog tags had not been lost. They were listed as unrecoverable in the original report, Carver said, because the officer who carried them out chose to keep that information private. That was... He paused. That was handled imperfectly on our end. Mr. Mercer exercised personal discretion in a situation that arguably should have had clearer protocol, but the circumstances were not ordinary. Ethan said nothing. He was looking at the table. "He told me not to make it official," he said finally. "Daniel, he said he was specific about this. He didn't want it to be a briefing. He didn't want Claire to hear this from a form or a notification. He wanted it to come from someone who was there." He looked up at Carver. "I followed that instruction for too long. That's on me." Carver looked at him for a moment. "Yes," he said simply. "It is." No softening of it, no reassurance, just the plain acknowledgement of a man who understood accountability, because he'd had to exercise it himself. Ethan nodded once. "I know." Claire had been writing on the legal pad. She stopped. "What did he say?" she asked. "Exactly. When he handed you the tags." She paused. "You told me last night he gave you a message. I need to hear the exact words." Ethan was quiet for a beat. He said, and I've thought about this a lot, so I'm pretty sure I have it right. He said, "Tell her I didn't hesitate. Tell her I'm not sorry for the choice, only for the leaving. And tell her to stop waiting for me to come home, because I already did, every time I thought of her." He stopped. His jaw was tight. "That's as close as I can give you." The conference room was very quiet. Carver on the screen looked away briefly. Not theatrically. Just the small, private gesture of a man who had heard enough hard things in his life to know when to give someone a moment. Claire looked at the legal pad. She'd written Daniel's name in the top corner at some point without realizing it. She put the pen down. "Thank you," she said. It came out steadier than she expected. "Ms. Whitmore," Carver said, "if it's any—" He stopped himself. He seemed to reconsider whatever he'd been about to say. "The Navy failed you in the way it communicated this situation. That's not a small thing. I'm sorry for my part in an institution that let that happen." She looked at him. "I appreciate that, Admiral." He nodded. "I'll send written confirmation of everything we've discussed today to your legal team by end of week. Mr. Mercer." He looked at Ethan. "For whatever it's worth, Daniel spoke of you before that mission. He said you were the kind of man he'd want covering the left side when things went wrong." Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. "He was the best commanding officer I ever served under," he said, "and that's the whole truth of it." Carver signed off. Short. The room stayed quiet after the laptop screen went dark. Claire reached over and closed it without quite thinking about it. The reflex of someone who managed her environment out of habit. Outside, through the glass partition between the conference room and the main office floor, she could see James at his desk, pretending to work on something while clearly monitoring whether she was going to emerge. She'd deal with that later. "You want coffee?" she asked. "There's probably still some that isn't completely ruined." "I'm fine," Ethan said. "I'm going to get some anyway." She stood, went to the small side table where the carafe lived, and poured what turned out to be legitimately terrible coffee into a mug she didn't remember getting out. She stood there for a moment with her back to him. "He said I already did every time I thought of her," she said. "Yeah." She turned around. "You memorized it." I knew this day was coming eventually. I didn't want to get it wrong. She looked at him across the conference table. He looked back at her, direct, not unkind, carrying in his face the particular weight of someone who has been holding something precious for someone else and has now, finally, put it down. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yeah." "The last 6 years. Not the waiting to find me. I understand that part, even if I don't fully forgive it yet." She watched his face. He didn't flinch at "don't fully forgive it yet," which was the right reaction. "I mean, the rest of it. Raising your daughter alone, the boat shop, all of it. Is that what you wanted? Or is that what happened to you?" It was a blunt question, the kind you didn't usually ask someone you'd met fewer than 20 hours ago. But the circumstances of how she'd met him were not usual, and she'd spent enough years managing a company to know that imprecise questions got imprecise answers. Ethan thought about it. She appreciated that he thought about it rather than reaching immediately for something reassuring. "Both," he said. "The boat shop. That's mine. I actually like the work. There's something about fixing something broken that's, I don't know, it's concrete. You start with something that doesn't work and you end with something that does." He paused. "Maya is not something that happened to me. She's the reason most of the rest of it makes sense. She's the one thing I can point to and say, I did that right." "Most of it," Claire said. "I come home with grease on my hands and I'm late to school pickup more than I'd like, and I don't know what to do with her hair, and last week I gave her cereal for dinner twice." He said this matter-of-factly. "She's happy, though. She's a genuinely happy kid. I don't know if that's because of me or in spite of me, but either way." Claire almost smiled. Not quite, but close. "The award tonight," she said. "The youth mentorship work. How long have you been doing that?" "Since about 2 years after I got out. I started going to this veterans transition program, mostly as a participant. I was having a rough time, and then after a while I started helping run it." He shrugged slightly. "I understand what it's like to leave a structure that made sense and try to figure out how to be a person outside of it. Seemed like the kind of thing I could be useful at." "Rough time," she repeated. He looked at her steadily. "Yeah." He didn't expand on it. She didn't push. Some things you named and some things you just acknowledged, and the distinction mattered. "Ethan." It was the first time she'd used his first name. She noticed it, and she thought he noticed it too. "What you did tonight, coming here, telling me this, I know it wasn't easy. I know some part of you didn't want to. Some part of me still doesn't want to," he said honestly. "It would have been easier to keep carrying it. At least it was familiar. But you came anyway." "Daniel asked me to." He said it simply. That was always going to be enough. She looked at her coffee. It was genuinely awful. She drank it anyway. "I'm going to need some time to process everything from today," she said, "before I figure out what I want to do next. I'm not going anywhere." He paused. "I mean that in the literal sense. I'm in Annapolis. I have a business there and a kid in school there. But if you have more questions, whenever, you call the number on the card." "I will." He stood, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He looked like a man who knew when a meeting was over and didn't linger past it, which was a quality she had spent years trying to cultivate in other people. "One more thing," he said. She looked at him. "He knew you'd be all right. He said that before he—" Another pause, the careful kind. He said, "She's going to be angry at me for a long time. And then she's going to be fine." He said it like he was sure of it. He looked at her steadily. For what it's worth, he was right about the second part. Claire stood in the conference room of her own company, holding a mug of terrible coffee, and felt the precise and complicated thing that was a compliment paid by a dead man through someone who had kept it safe for 6 years. "He didn't actually know that," she said. "He just wanted it to be true." "Maybe," Ethan said. "But you're still standing in a corner office running a company, so either he was right or you made him right. At some point, the distinction stops mattering." He left before she could answer that. She stayed where she was for a moment. Then she set down the coffee, went to the window she never looked out of, and looked out of it. The city was busy and indifferent below, full of people going about business that had nothing to do with the particular grief and the particular truth and the particular complicated gratitude currently occupying the top floor of this building. She watched it for a while. Then she went back to work, because that was what she did, and because somewhere a 7-year-old girl was going to need to be picked up from school, and a boat that needed fixing was waiting in Annapolis, and none of it would wait for grief to finish being grief. But the truth was in the room now. Daniel's truth. The real shape of what had happened. And it was heavy, and it was painful, and it was, in a way she hadn't expected, something like a gift. 3 days passed before Claire called. Ethan was under a 1987 Grady White when his phone buzzed against the concrete floor of the shop, and he had to slide out from beneath the hull with fiberglass dust on his forearms and a flashlight still in his hand to answer it. He saw the DC area code and sat up against the side of the boat before picking up. "Mercer," he said, out of habit. A brief pause. "It's Claire Whitmore." "I know." Another pause, shorter. "I've been going through the declassified materials Admiral Carver sent over. There's more detail in them than I expected." She stopped. "I also pulled Daniel's letters, the ones he sent from deployment. I hadn't read them in 3 years." He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say to that. "I'm not calling to process my feelings at you," she said. "I just wanted you to know that I believe everything you told me, completely. And I'm working on what comes next." "Okay," he said. "That's it? Just okay? I didn't think you were calling for my opinion on your timeline." A beat. "You're very hard to rattle. I've been told." She almost said something, stopped, rerouted. "I have a meeting in Annapolis next Thursday. Naval Support Facility, some government contract review. I'll be in your area." She paused again, and he got the impression she was choosing what came next carefully. "If you're not busy, I'd like to see you, and your shop." "I don't know why, it just seems like I should." He looked around the shop. Oil-stained floor, pegboard hung with tools, a half-restored Chris-Craft on sawhorses in the back that was going to be beautiful someday if he ever found the time. The smell of 2-part epoxy and salt air that came off the water 3 blocks away. "Thursday's fine," he said. "I'm usually here by 7. Your meeting doesn't start until 10. Then you can come at 7 and leave by 9:30 and still make your meeting." She didn't respond immediately. He wondered if he'd miscalculated the tone. "All right," she said. 7. She arrived at 7:04, which he suspected was as close to 7 as her schedule ever actually permitted. She was in different clothes than the gala or the office. Dark jeans, a simple jacket, boots that were practical rather than decorative. She looked like herself, he thought, in a way that she hadn't quite looked like herself in the places where she had to perform the role of who she was. He handed her a coffee without asking if she wanted one. She took it without asking what was in it. "This is smaller than I expected," she said, looking around the shop. "It's exactly as small as it needs to be." She walked slowly along the perimeter, looking at the boats in various states of assembly and repair, the tools on the wall, the handwritten job tickets on a corkboard by the door. She stopped in front of the Chris-Craft. "How long have you had this one?" 14 months. Owner ran her aground and then decided he didn't want to deal with the repairs himself. "I bought her from him." He came to stand beside her, looking at the hull. "She's a 1962. When she's done, she'll be worth about 4 times what I've put into her." "When will she be done?" "Honestly, no idea. I work on her when I have time, which isn't as often as I'd like." He paused. "She doesn't have a deadline. That's partly why I like her." Claire studied the boat, the stripped-back wood, the careful preliminary work he'd done on the hull seams. "You do all of this yourself?" "I have one guy who comes in 3 days a week. Danny. He's 22, came out of a vocational program. Good hands, bad punctuality." He drank his coffee. "It works." She turned to look at him. "I've been thinking about what you said in the conference room, about fixing something broken." She held his gaze. "I've been running a company for 3 years. I fix things for a living, too. It's just that the things I fix they're abstract. Security gaps, operational failures, structural problems in code, or in organizations. You can solve them and never touch them." She looked back at the boat. "I can't remember the last time I fixed something I could actually put my hands on." He didn't answer right away. He was looking at the Chris-Craft, not at her. You want to try? He said. She looked at him. He nodded at the hull. I've got a section of planking on the port side that needs caulking before I can prime it. It's not complicated work, mostly patience. He set down his coffee and picked up a caulking tool from the workbench. Here, I'll show you once, and then you can do it. She stared at him. I'm in a $300 jacket. There's an apron on the hook by the door. She looked at the apron. She looked at the boat. He could see the exact moment she decided, because her expression shifted from calculating to simply present in a way that happened fast and looked like it surprised even her. She put on the apron. She was not good at it. That wasn't the point. He didn't expect her to be good at it. But she was precise, and she didn't complain. And when she got the angle wrong on the first 2 passes, she asked him to show her again instead of pretending she'd understood. By the 3rd pass, she had the pressure about right. By the 6th, she was doing it without thinking, moving steadily down the seam with her wrist at the correct angle, and she was quiet in a way that didn't feel empty. Can I ask you something? She said without looking up from the work. You keep asking me if you can ask me something and then asking it regardless of what I say. That's because I know what your answer is. She paused her work. Did Daniel ever talk about what he wanted? After the Navy, what he imagined doing? Ethan thought about it honestly. He talked about a boat, he said. She went still. Not like this, he said quickly. Not a project. He wanted to sail. Said when he was done, he was going to take a couple months and just go up the coast, maybe all the way to Maine. He wanted you to come. He paused. He talked about it like it was definitely going to happen, not like a dream, like a plan he hadn't made official yet. Claire was looking at the hull without seeing it. He never told me that, she said quietly. I think it was partly a surprise. Ethan picked up a rag and cleaned the tip of the caulking tool without being asked. He was going to pitch it to you after his next rotation, take you somewhere and explain the whole idea. He looked at her carefully. He was a little worried you'd say it was impractical. It is impractical. I know. I think that's partly why he liked it. She turned her face away from him toward the open shop door, where the morning was fully established now, gray and salt-smelled and quiet. A seagull landed on the dock railing, visible from where they stood, and immediately looked disappointed about something, the way seagulls always did. He would have loved this shop, she said. Yeah, Ethan said. He would have. It was the first time they'd talked about Daniel in the past tense together, without it being the subject of a formal conversation, and the difference was significant in a way neither of them named. It was just there, like the smell of the water, ambient, present, understood. She went back to the caulking. He let her. She left at 9:20 with a small streak of caulking compound on her left wrist that she hadn't noticed yet and probably wouldn't until she was sitting in some government conference room and looked down at her hands. He thought about mentioning it and decided not to. Some things were fine to let people discover on their own. She came back on the following Thursday, and the one after that. It wasn't a scheduled thing. The first time she returned, she called the morning of and said she had a canceled appointment and was already in Annapolis and asked if he minded. He said he didn't. She showed up at 8:15 with 2 coffees from a place downtown that was noticeably better than his shop pot and spent 90 minutes helping him strip old varnish from the Chris Crafts transom while he talked her through why you stripped before you sanded and not the other way around. The second time she just showed up. No call. He heard this car in the lot and looked out the shop door, and there she was, in a different jacket, looking slightly like she wasn't sure she'd done the right thing. I was in the area, she said. You're always in the area now, he said. Annapolis is a significant naval support hub. You run a data security company. She looked at him. He looked at her. He stepped back from the doorway to let her in. She spent that visit sanding, which she had gotten genuinely good at, and somewhere around the second hour she started talking. Not about Daniel, not about the gala, but about the company. A board conflict she was navigating. A senior executive who was positioning himself for a hostile internal restructure. She described it in the clipped technical shorthand of someone accustomed to discussing these things with people who spoke the same language, and then she seemed to remember who she was talking to and slowed down to give him the plain version. Don't, he said. She stopped. Don't what? Don't translate it down. I can follow. She looked at him for a moment. Most people can't. I managed multi-million-dollar mission logistics with 6 hours of planning and incomplete intelligence. I can follow an org chart. She studied him for a moment with the particular focus of someone recalibrating. Then she started over, at full speed, with none of the simplified scaffolding, and he listened and asked 3 questions, and by the time she was done, she had a clearer picture of the board situation than she'd had when she walked in. "You should have been a strategist," she said. "I was," he said. "I just mostly did it in places nobody could talk about afterward." She laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh. A real one, not the social function variety he'd heard at the gala. And it was slightly surprised, like it had gotten out before she'd decided to let it. Well, it was Maya who complicated things, the way Maya complicated most things. She was out of school early on a Wednesday in mid-November. Parent-teacher conferences, which meant Ethan had her in the shop from noon onward. She did her homework at his desk for about 40 minutes, and then came to find him, as she always did when she ran out of tolerance for sitting still, and he put her to work sorting hardware. A job she considered beneath her but tolerated because he let her listen to music while she did it. She was sorting bolts by size and singing quietly to something from her earbuds when Claire's car pulled into the lot. Ethan was aware of it in the particular way you became aware of things you were going to need to manage. He wiped his hands and went to the door. Claire came in and saw Maya at the same moment Maya looked up, earbuds half out, the way kids pulled their headphones out halfway to acknowledge an adult without fully committing to conversation. "Hi," Maya said. "Hi," Claire said. She looked at Ethan. "My daughter Maya," he said. "Maya, this is Ms. Whitmore." "You can say Claire," Claire said, and then seemed to briefly evaluate whether that had been the right call. Maya, for her part, was already at the stage of assessment that children did without disguising it, just looking at Claire with frank, unhurried curiosity. "Dad didn't say you were coming today," Maya said. "I didn't know," Ethan said. "I should have called," Claire said. "It's fine," Ethan said. "Do you fix boats too?" Maya asked Claire. "I'm learning," Claire said. Maya considered this. "Dad's teaching me too. He says I have good instincts, but I don't listen the first time." "That's fair," Claire said. "I have the same problem." Maya looked at her father, apparently recalibrating Claire upward from neutral to acceptable, and went back to her bolts. Ethan watched Claire track the interaction, and he saw something in her face that was careful and private and probably meant more than he was going to ask about. She turned to him. "I can come back," she said, low. "You don't have to." "I don't want to intrude." "You're not intruding." He looked at her. "She's just a kid. She's not going to make it weird unless we make it weird." Claire looked at Maya, who was back to sorting and singing to herself with one earbud in and one out, the portrait of a child who had made a decision about a situation and moved on from it. "Okay," Claire said. She stayed. She didn't do much work. Mostly she sat on a stool near the bench and talked with Ethan about the board situation, which had developed complications over the past week. Occasionally Maya would wander over to show her something. A particularly large bolt she'd found, a piece of teak scrap she'd decided was interestingly shaped. And Claire would look at it seriously and say something that was neither condescending nor forced, and Maya would nod and go back to her own work. At 4 o'clock, Ethan started thinking about dinner. He had chicken in the refrigerator at home and no particular plan. "You want to eat with us?" he said to Claire. She looked up from her phone where she'd been answering something. "I wasn't planning to stay." "I know, but it's 4 o'clock and you haven't eaten since that coffee you brought, and I have to feed Maya anyway." She seemed to weigh this against something. "I can't cook," she said. It came out like a warning. "I didn't ask you to cook. I'm serious, it's a genuine skill gap. I'm not being modest. I'll cook. You can sit in the kitchen and keep me company." She looked at him, and there was something in her face he didn't quite know how to categorize. Not reluctance, more like the particular wariness of a person who'd kept her life very controlled for a long time and could feel that control gently, persistently shifting. "All right," she said. His house was 8 blocks from the shop, a narrow 2-story with a front porch that needed paint and a yard that was mostly managed by good intentions and irregular weekends. Inside it was clean in the functional sense, dishes done, floors swept, the surfaces that Maya used regularly clear of clutter, without being arranged. Books were stacked sideways on shelves because there wasn't quite enough room for them to stand upright. Maya's school drawings were held to the refrigerator with magnets from places Ethan had never been, left by a previous tenant. The couch had a throw blanket on it that had been washed enough times that it had lost any opinion about what color it originally was. Claire stood in the kitchen doorway while Ethan started on the chicken, and Maya disappeared upstairs to change out of her school clothes, and she looked at the drawings on the refrigerator. "She draws a lot?" Claire asked. "Constantly. She goes through those big sketch pads in about 3 weeks." He turned the heat up under the pan. "The art teacher called me in September to tell me she was exceptionally talented. I didn't know what to do with that information, so I bought her more sketch pads." "That seems like the right response?" "I hope so. I don't actually know that much about art." "What do you know about?" He thought about it. Boats, military history, basic carpentry, weather patterns on the Chesapeake, how to keep a 7-year-old from going completely feral with no other kids around. He added oil to the pan. "I know enough about enough things. I've learned that's different from knowing a lot about any one thing, but it's more useful on average." She sat down at the kitchen table. It was a small table, round, 4 chairs, one of which currently held Maya's backpack and a library book about volcanoes. Claire moved the backpack to the floor carefully and put the library book on top of it. "I know a lot about one thing," she said. "Data security infrastructure. Adjacent things. Enough to run a company, but my actual deep knowledge is fairly narrow." She paused. "Daniel used to say I was the smartest person in any given room and also completely useless in a power outage." Ethan kept his back to her while the chicken went into the pan, so she could say what she needed to say without him watching her say it. "He wasn't wrong," she said. "I couldn't even change the batteries in the smoke detector for the first year after he died. Not because I didn't know how, because it was the kind of thing he always did, and I kept walking past it." The chicken sizzled. He let the sound do the work for a moment. "How long before you changed it?" he said. 14 months. "My neighbor finally said something." A pause. "I've never told anyone that." "All right. You're not going to say anything?" "What would I say?" He glanced at her over his shoulder. "I went 4 months without replacing a burned-out bulb in the hall because it was on the list of things my wife used to do, and I wasn't ready to take it over. I changed the batteries in every smoke detector in the house the first week because I was terrified of the idea of something happening to Maya in her sleep. Everything else..." He turned back to the stove. "You pick the things you can handle, and you let the other things wait until you can." She was quiet. 14 months isn't that long," he said. "For a thing like that?" "No," she agreed. "I guess it isn't." Maya came back downstairs in leggings and a sweatshirt with a horse on it, having discarded her school clothes with the efficiency of a child who had a strong preference for comfort over presentation. She sat down at the table across from Claire and opened the volcano book to a page she'd apparently been thinking about. "Did you know that some volcanoes are underwater?" she said, directing this at Claire with the specific energy of a child who has decided to share interesting information with an adult and is going to do so regardless of context. "I did know that," Claire said. "We're going to learn about them next semester. We're doing earth science." "What do you think about that?" Maya considered. "It's okay. I like the volcano part. The rocks part is boring." "The rocks are how you understand the volcanoes," Ethan said from the stove. "I know, Dad, you've said that. I'll keep saying it." Maya gave Claire a look that communicated something in the particular language of children around adults who didn't live with them. Not quite complicity, more like acknowledgement that certain dynamics were universal and recognizable. Claire received this without making a production of it, which was the right response, and turned a page of the volcano book that Maya had pushed toward her. "Which part are you on?" Claire asked. "The Pacific Ring of Fire," Maya said. "There's a map." "Show me the map." Maya showed her the map. Ethan cooked dinner and listened to his daughter explain tectonic plate boundaries to a CEO who was giving the subject her full, genuine attention, and there was something about the particular ordinariness of the scene that hit him in a way he hadn't prepared for. Not pain, exactly. Something more complicated. The sense of a shape that had been missing from the room for a long time, not replaced exactly, but present in a way that was different from the usual absence. He didn't name it. Naming things too early had a way of collapsing them. He cooked dinner and let the moment be what it was. 2 weeks later, the call came that changed things again. It was James, Claire's deputy director, and he reached Ethan on the shop line at 10 in the morning, which told him Claire hadn't given him a cell number and had chosen not to call herself. "Miss Whitmore would like to meet," James said. "Today, if possible. She says to tell you it's not about Daniel." He drove to D.C. in 2.5 hours, which was faster than normal, and arrived at Whitmore Technologies to find Claire in her conference room with 2 people he didn't know, a woman in a dark suit who had attorney written across her entire posture, and a man who introduced himself as Marcus Webb, and whose background, from the way he carried himself and chose his words, was almost certainly federal law enforcement of some kind, current or former. Claire looked tightly controlled in the way she looked when something was costing her, and she wasn't willing to let it show at full scale. "Sit down," she said to Ethan, then to the other 2. "You can tell him." Webb leaned forward. "Mr. Mercer, I'll be direct. We've been running a parallel investigation into the financial structure of Whitmore Technologies for the past 8 months, primarily focused on a series of internal transfers that appear to be connected to a shell company structure set up 18 months ago by a senior member of the executive team." Ethan looked at Claire. "Your COO." Something moved in her expression. "You knew?" "I didn't know. But you told me about the board situation, and when you described how it was playing out, who was positioning, how, in what sequence, I thought it sounded like someone who already had an exit strategy. Someone who was moving assets." He paused. "I didn't want to say it in case I was wrong." Webb was watching this exchange with the particular attentiveness of someone storing it. "His name is Richard Calloway," the attorney, who turned out to be a DOJ liaison named Priya Sood, said. "He's been systematically diverting funds through a series of contractor invoices that aren't attached to any real services. We're talking about approximately $12 million over the past 18 months. "The board conflict," Claire said quietly, more to herself than anyone. "He was pushing me into a restructure that would have given him oversight of the contract approval process." Her jaw was tight. "He needed me distracted." "He was also using the restructure as cover," Webb said. "If the company had reorganized along the lines he was proposing, the shell company transactions would have become substantially harder to trace. He needed time." "How much time does he have left?" Ethan asked. "We're moving toward an arrest warrant within 2 weeks," Sood said. "We're here today because Ms. Whitmore is a cooperating party, and she wanted to be informed of the timeline, and because—" she looked at Ethan directly, "because she indicated you might have context on the nature of the board positioning that could be useful to the investigation." He thought about the conversations in the shop, the ones where Claire had described the boardroom chess and he'd listened and asked questions. He thought about the specific patterns he'd noticed, the sequencing, the way each move Calloway made was designed to foreclose a specific option for Claire before she identified it as an option. "I can walk you through what I observed," he said. "But I want to be clear that what I know comes from conversations with Miss Whitmore, not from any independent access to the company." "That's understood," Sood said. "Then, yes, I can help." Claire looked at him across the table. She looked, he thought, like someone who had been fighting a battle on a field she could see clearly and had just discovered there was an enemy on a second front she hadn't been watching. And also like someone who, for possibly the first time in this particular fight, didn't feel like she was fighting it entirely alone. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet. I might be wrong about half of it." "You probably aren't," she said. "You have a very annoying track record." Sood and Webb exchanged a brief look that contained an entire office conversation they weren't having out loud. The meeting went on for another 3 hours. Ethan walked them through what he'd heard and what he'd inferred, drawing the distinction clearly at each point between observed fact and analytical conclusion, and Webb took notes with the rapid shorthand efficiency of someone who had spent years condensing important information before it got away from him. By the time they finished, it was past 3 in the afternoon, and the light through the windows was going gray and thin. Sood and Webb left with handshakes and the particular brisk purposefulness of people who had somewhere important to be immediately. Ethan and Claire stayed at the conference table. "You should have told me you'd figured it out," she said. Not angry, just matter of fact. "I wasn't sure. And it's your company. I didn't want to come in with a theory that might be half wrong and make things more complicated." You could have asked me more questions. I could have, he admitted. I also thought you had it. She looked at him. I didn't have it. He had 18 months on me. You had the DOJ. I didn't call the DOJ. They came to me. Someone in the accounting department filed an anonymous report 7 months ago. She paused. I've been running this company for 3 years, and one of my own accountants knew something was wrong before I did. There was a specific quality to the way she said it. Not self-pity, more like the hard clarity of someone used to high standards, examining a place where they didn't meet them. He understood that quality. He'd spent a lot of time with it himself. You were also dealing with a board being systematically worked against you in a personal situation you hadn't anticipated, he said. You're not actually required to catch everything. I run a security company. You're also a person. He paused. You keep forgetting that's allowed. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at him. Calloway has been with the company since before I took over. I promoted him. She said it flatly. I looked at his numbers and his record, and I put him in the COO seat, and he used that seat to steal from the company for 1.5 years. You couldn't have known. Maybe, but I should have seen the signs earlier than I did. She looked away. Daniel would have seen it. The name landed in the room the way it always did when she said it. Not awkwardly, but with weight. He let it sit. Maybe, he said. Daniel also spent 11 years training for exactly that kind of threat assessment. It was his specific expertise. It wasn't yours. He paused. You build things, security infrastructure, company structure, teams. You're a builder. You're not set up to assume the person next to you is dismantling what you're building while you work. She was quiet for a moment. That's either the most generous thing you've ever said to me, she said, or the most accurate. Probably both. She almost smiled. It was a tired version of the laugh he'd heard in the shop. Smaller, but real. I need to call my legal team, she said. I know. And I need to figure out how to protect the company's operations during whatever comes next, because when the arrest becomes public, this is going to be on every business news outlet within about 40 minutes, and my clients are going to start calling. I know that too. And I should call Admiral Carver, because he has contacts who can help me verify whether any of the compromised contractor structure overlaps with any federal clearance work, which it might, which would be Claire. He said it the way he'd learned to say things when something needed to stop and be looked at for a second. Quiet, but with enough weight to register. She stopped. Breathe, he said. She did. One slow breath, not theatrical, just actual. You have a team, he said. You have James and you have Sud and you have a legal department. You can start making calls in 5 minutes. But for 5 minutes, you can just be a person who just found out someone she trusted betrayed her, and let that be what it is for 60 seconds. She looked at him across the conference table. The light was gray, and the city was doing its indifferent business outside the window, and the room was quiet. I trusted him, she said. I know. He sat across from me in this room. He sat in the chair you're sitting in, probably, and talked about the company's future like he gave a damn about it. People who do what he did are very good at that. It's the actual skill they have. She exhaled. I know that's true. A pause. It still makes me want to put my fist through the wall. That's fair. I'm not going to. I know. She looked at him for another moment. Something passed between them that was acknowledgement more than anything. The specific acknowledgement of two people who had both had things taken from them by choices made while their backs were turned, and who had both separately, and now somewhat less separately, kept going anyway. Thank you for coming today, she said. You would have figured it out without me. Probably, she said. But I'm glad I didn't have to. She picked up her phone and started making calls, and Ethan stayed at the table and let her use the room, because sometimes that was the most useful thing a person could do. Just remain present while someone handled what needed to be handled, steady and undemanding, the way certain structures held weight without announcing that they were holding it. Richard Calloway was arrested on a Tuesday morning at 7:42 in the parking structure beneath his apartment building in Georgetown, before he had gotten into his car. Ethan learned about it from a text message Claire sent at 8:15. 2 sentences, no punctuation at the end. It happened. He's in custody. He was in the middle of replacing impeller housing on a center console, and he read the message twice and then set his phone face down on the workbench and went back to work. Because there wasn't anything to do with the information yet, and the impeller wasn't going to wait. She called at noon. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I've been on the phone since 6 this morning." Her voice had the particular flatness of someone running on 3 hours of sleep and professional necessity. "My general counsel is managing the legal exposure. James is coordinating the communications response. I have a call with our 3 largest federal clients at 2 o'clock that I'm—" A pause. "I'm not looking forward to." "You'll handle it." "I know I'll handle it. That's not the same as looking forward to it." She stopped. He heard her move. The sound of a chair, a door closing, the particular silence of someone stepping away from a busy office into a quieter space. They found the complete transfer record. $12.4 million over 22 months. He had 3 shell companies. He'd started moving money out of the 3rd one 2 weeks ago. Another pause. If the arrest had been delayed another month, he probably could have made things significantly messier for the company. But it wasn't delayed. "No," she exhaled. "Webb told me this morning that the anonymous tip from my accounting department is the reason they had enough to move when they did. 7 months of building from that initial report." She was quiet for a beat. "Her name is Sandra Okafor. She's been with the company for 4 years. I knew who she was. I knew the name, but I'd never had a real conversation with her." "Are you going to?" "I already did. I called her at 7 this morning." A pause. She thought she was getting fired. She picked up the phone thinking I was calling to let her go. He was quiet. "She spent 7 months watching something she knew was wrong and deciding whether to say something," Claire said. "She said she almost didn't. She said she drafted the report 4 times before she actually sent it." "What did you say to her?" "I told her she saved the company. I told her I was sorry she'd had to make that decision alone." She stopped. "And then I told her I was giving her a significant raise and a new title, and that her job was completely secure because I'm running a security company. And I just found out that the most important security decision of the past year was made by a mid-level accountant who was scared of losing her job." He could hear in her voice the particular edge of a person who had assessed something clearly and was angry about what the assessment revealed. Not at Sandra Okafor, not even really at Callaway anymore. At herself, and at the structure that had made it possible for someone to spend 7 months uncertain about whether doing the right thing would cost her everything. "That was the right call," he said. "It's the minimum. It's not enough, but it's the minimum." She paused. "I'm going to overhaul the entire internal reporting structure. Anonymous channels, independent oversight, the works. I should have done it 2 years ago." "You couldn't have known what you didn't know 2 years ago." "I know. I'm still going to fix it." She said it with a finality that wasn't harsh, just settled. This was what she did with things that had gone wrong. She looked at them directly, assessed the damage honestly, and started building the corrected version before the original mess was fully cleaned up. He'd seen that quality in her enough times now to recognize it as bone deep. "Claire," he said. "What?" "Eat something before the 2 o'clock call." A brief silence. "James says that to me at least twice a day," she said. "James is right." "I know James is right. That's also not the same as having time to do it." But the edge in her voice had shifted slightly. Some of the flatness had gone out of it, replaced by something that was almost ordinary. The effect of being told a simple human thing by a person who wasn't going to dress it up. "I'll let you get back to it," he said. "Thank you, Ethan." She said his name the way she'd started saying it over the past weeks, naturally, without the slight deliberateness of the early conversations, the way you stop noticing a threshold once you've crossed it enough times. For yesterday, and generally, for the past few weeks. "You would have gotten here without me. I keep telling you to stop saying that. And I keep saying it because it's true." She made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite argument, which he was fairly sure was the closest she came to accepting a compliment without deflecting it entirely. She hung up. He went back to the impeller housing. The story broke at 4:17 that afternoon, which was faster than Claire had predicted and right on schedule with what Ethan had expected. He knew because Maya was doing homework at his desk when his phone started showing the same headlines from 3 different news apps he'd forgotten he had installed. Whitmore Technologies COO arrested on federal fraud charges, $12 million in diverted funds. He turned the screen face down again and didn't say anything to Maya about it because there was nothing to say. She was working on long division, which was giving her trouble in the specific way that long division gave a lot of kids trouble. Not because she didn't understand the concept, but because she kept losing track of the steps mid-problem and starting over rather than checking her work. "You're doing too much in your head," he said, leaning over to look at her work. "Write down the intermediate steps. It takes longer, but you'd get it right. Getting it right faster is better. Getting it right is better, full stop. Getting it right faster is something you earn by getting it right slowly enough times that it becomes automatic." He tapped the page. "Write down the steps." She wrote down the steps. She got it right. She did not look as satisfied about this as he thought she should, but he'd learned that Maya processed satisfaction internally and on a delay. She'd come back to him in 20 minutes with a different problem and do it correctly from the start, the lesson integrated without ceremony. He made dinner and thought about Claire's 2 o'clock call and whether it had gone well and decided it almost certainly had, because she was very good at those calls, even when she didn't feel like she was. He didn't text her. She had enough people texting her. She texted him at 9:43 after Maya was in bed. 2 o'clock went fine, all 3 clients staying. Calloway's attorney already issued a statement claiming duress. "It's going to get messy before it gets clean." He typed back, "It usually does. You all right?" A longer pause than usual. "I will be. I keep thinking about the gala. 6 weeks ago. It feels like longer." He looked at that for a moment. "6 weeks is long enough for a lot to change," he wrote back. "Yes," she replied. And then, after another pause, "It is." He set the phone down and listened to the house settle, the particular sounds of an old structure at night, the tick of pipes, and the occasional creak of the staircase that he'd been meaning to fix for 2 years and kept not fixing. Maya's light was off under the door at the top of the stairs. He thought about Daniel, which he did most nights, but which had taken on a different texture in the past 6 weeks. In the years immediately after the mission, it had been guilt-shaped. The thought of Daniel, the specific, circular guilt of a man who had gotten on a helicopter because he was ordered to and had been arguing with that order ever since. Later, it had become something quieter, more like a conversation with someone who wasn't there, the kind of internal monologue you kept having with a person after you'd run out of time to have it with them directly. Now it was something else again, something he didn't fully have language for yet. He went to bed. He slept adequately, which was the best he usually managed. The following 2 weeks moved the way consequential things often moved, fast in some directions and glacially in others. The federal case against Calloway developed with the methodical, unsexy pace of actual legal proceedings, which bore no resemblance to how legal proceedings appeared in television dramas and involved a great deal of documentation and very few dramatic moments. Claire's communications team managed the public narrative with a precision that Ethan, watching from a distance, recognized as genuine skill. The framing was honest without being self-flagellating, clear about what had happened without speculating about what hadn't, and the emphasis throughout was on the structural reforms already underway rather than the failure that had made them necessary. He read the coverage when it came up and mostly put his phone away and worked on the Chris craft, which was at the point in its restoration where the cosmetic work was starting and the results were becoming visible in a way that was genuinely satisfying after 14 months of work that mostly just looked like damage being repaired. Claire came to Annapolis on a Wednesday afternoon, unannounced as had become her version of normal, and stood in front of the boat for a long moment without saying anything. "The hull color," she said finally. "White with a navy stripe," he said. "Same as the original spec." "It's beautiful." He looked at the boat. She was right. He'd been living with the project long enough that he'd stopped seeing it properly, and sometimes it took someone looking at it fresh to remind him what he was actually doing. "Getting there," he said. She turned. She looked tired in a different way than she'd looked tired the day of the arrest. That had been operational exhaustion, the flatness of a person running on adrenaline and task lists. This was something more settled, the kind of tired that came after the acute phase of something had passed, and the body finally sent you the bill. I want to do something, she said. He waited. I want to establish a foundation for children of fallen service members, education support, transition support, the kinds of things that don't get enough funding. She held his gaze steadily. And I want you to run it. He was quiet for a moment. Claire, I'm not doing this because of Daniel, she said. And he could hear that she'd thought about how to say this, that she'd considered the various ways he might receive it. Or I'm not only doing it because of Daniel. I've wanted to do something like this for a long time, and I've had 1,000 good reasons to delay it. And I'm done delaying it. A pause. But I also want it run by someone who understands what those families actually need. Not someone who's read the research, someone who's lived it. I have a business, he said. I know. I have a daughter in school here. I know that too. The foundation would be based in Annapolis. You wouldn't have to relocate. She paused. Danny, your guy, he's been here long enough to manage the shop day to day, hasn't he? He looked at her. You've thought about this. I think about things I care about. She said it simply, without making it more than it was. The shop doesn't have to close. You don't have to choose. I'm asking you to run a program that does what you're already doing for the Veterans Transition Organization, except with actual funding and actual infrastructure. She paused. An official terrible coffee, which I understand is an essential part of the work environment. He almost smiled. Didn't quite. What does running it actually mean? Directing the program, identifying which families need what, building relationships with the veteran community and the service branches, supervising the staff. She paused. Being the person who knows what he's talking about in the room so that the money actually does what it's supposed to do instead of what well-meaning money usually does. Which is what? Goes to the wrong places for the right reasons. She said it with the precise cynicism of someone who had watched institutional funding miss its actual target enough times to have developed firm opinions about it. I've sat through enough nonprofit boards to know that programs like this almost always end up serving the people who are easiest to reach, instead of the people who need it most. I need someone who can tell the difference. He was quiet, looking at the boat. She let him be quiet. I'd need to think about it, he said. I expected that. I'd need to talk to Maya. Of course. And I'd want to understand the governance structure before I said yes to anything. I'm not interested in being the name on something I don't actually have control over. I wouldn't offer you something I didn't actually mean. She said this with a directness that wasn't defensive, just clear. You'd have operational authority, real authority. I'd be the funding source and the board chair, and I'd get out of your way unless you needed me not to. He turned from the boat and looked at her directly. Why me? Specifically. Not, I understand the reasoning, but why are you sure? She looked at him. It was the kind of look that had a lot behind it, and she seemed to be deciding how much of it to put into words. Because you kept a promise for 6 years that cost you something, she said. Bucks fortune. Because when you finally showed up to fulfill it, you did it in the hardest possible way, in public, in a room full of strangers with no preparation and no guarantee anyone would believe you, because you have a daughter you're raising correctly under circumstances that would have broken other people. She paused. And because in the past 6 weeks you've helped me navigate the worst professional crisis of my career and the strangest personal development of the past 6 years simultaneously, and you've done all of it without once making me feel like I owed you for it. Another pause, shorter. I trust you. That's the actual answer. I don't trust a lot of people, and I trust you, and I want to build something that deserves to be trusted. He held her gaze for a moment. I'll think about it, he said again. But the way he said it was different the second time, and they both knew it. He talked to Maya that evening after dinner, which he'd been turning over since the conversation in the shop. How to explain it, how much to explain, how to talk to a 7-year-old about the weight behind an offer that had roots she didn't fully know about yet. He sat on the edge of her bed while she organized her colored pencils, which was her version of winding down. Can I tell you something? He said. Is it bad? No, it's maybe good. I'm not sure yet. She set down the pencils and looked at him with the particular seriousness of a child who has learned to gauge when her parent is about to say something that matters. He told her, in the simplified but honest version he'd been working on all evening, Someone had offered him a job, a different kind of job than the shop, one that helped families whose parents were in the military. He'd still have the shop. Things wouldn't change much, but he wanted to know what she thought. Maya listened without interrupting, which she only did when she was really paying attention. "Is Ms. Whitmore the one who offered it?" she said when he finished. "Claire, yeah. Because of the dog tags thing?" He looked at her. He'd given her a version of the dog tag story a couple of weeks earlier, simplified, age-appropriate, enough to explain why Claire kept showing up without making Maya carry the weight of the full history. She'd absorbed it with the thoughtful quiet she brought to most things, and then gone back to whatever she'd been doing, and he'd figured she was processing it in the internal, delayed way that was her pattern. "Partly," he said, "and partly because she thinks I'm the right person." "Are you?" "I think so. Maybe." She considered this. She picked up a dark blue pencil and turned it in her fingers, not drawing with it, just holding it. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "Mom's dog tags. The ones that Ms. Whitmore's husband had." She looked at him carefully. "You kept them because he asked you to, right? You didn't keep them because you wanted to." He was quiet for a moment. This was one of those Maya moments, the ones that came out of nowhere and revealed that she'd been thinking about something much harder than her age suggested was typical. "That's right," he said. "And now you gave them back." "More or less." "So you did what you were supposed to do," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah." She nodded slowly, set the pencil back in its row. "I think you should do the job," she said. "I think you should do it because it's the next thing, and you're good at doing the next thing even when it's hard." He looked at his daughter in the dim light of her bedroom, with her volcano book on the nightstand and her pencils organized by shade, and felt the particular complicated thing that was ordinary parental love mixed with the specific astonishment of watching a small person be wiser than you'd budgeted for. "Okay," he said. "Okay, you'll do it?" "Okay, I'll seriously think about it." She accepted this with the pragmatism of a child who understood the difference between a yes and an almost yes, and knew which one she'd gotten. "Good night, Dad." "Good night, Maya." He turned off her light and stood in the hallway for a moment in the dark. Then he went downstairs and sat at the kitchen table and thought for a long time. He called Claire in the morning. "I'll do it," he said. "Conditional on seeing the governance documents and having final say on program design." A pause that was shorter than he expected. "Done and done. And I want Sandra Okafor on the advisory board." A longer pause. "The accountant. She spent 7 months watching something wrong and decided to say something anyway when she didn't have to and thought it might cost her everything. That's exactly the quality of judgment a board like this needs." He heard something in Claire's silence that was part surprise and part the particular sound of a person encountering an idea that was right and knowing it immediately. "I'll ask her," she said. "Good. Ethan." She paused. "Thank you. You haven't seen the governance notes I'm going to send you. You might change your mind." "I won't. I might send a lot of notes. I'm counting on it." Another pause. "I'm going to need a name for the foundation." He thought about it. Outside, the November morning was gray, and the water a block away was doing what the Chesapeake did in November. Dark, purposeful, not interested in being picturesque. "Give me a few days," he said. "Take your time." He almost said something else. He wasn't sure what. The moment passed, easy and unforced, the way moments passed between people who had stopped being careful around each other without marking the exact point it happened. He hung up. He got his jacket. He walked to the shop in the cold, one hand in his pocket. The dog tags against his chest where they always were, warm from his skin, 2 small pieces of metal that had outlasted their original purpose and found a new one without anyone planning for it. The next 3 weeks were full in a way that was different from the usual fullness of his days. There were calls with Claire's legal team and long documents with dense governance language that he read carefully and marked up extensively, sending back comments that James described diplomatically as thorough. There were conversations with Danny about the shop, longer, more serious conversations than they usually had, in which Danny demonstrated for the first time that he was capable of managing operations with significantly more independence than Ethan had been allowing him, which was partly a revelation and partly a reminder that you sometimes underestimated people because their reliability made you forget they were capable of more. Maya started coming to the shop less and asking more questions about the foundation. She wanted to know what it would actually do. Not in abstract terms, but concretely, specifically, what happened when a family needed help and how they found out they could get it, and who made the decision and how long it took. He answered as precisely as he could, and when he didn't know the answer, he said so. She seemed to respect that more than an uncertain answer dressed up as knowledge would have gotten her. On a Thursday in early December, Claire drove down from D.C. and they sat at his kitchen table with coffee and printed documents and went through the foundational structure piece by piece: program scope, governance, initial funding allocation, the timeline for the first grant cycle. She'd brought a revised draft that incorporated every note he'd sent, and he'd looked at it long enough before she arrived to know that she'd taken all of it seriously, not just the easy parts. They worked for 4 hours. Maya came home from school midway through, said hello to Claire with the easy familiarity of a kid who decided a person was fine and stopped performing uncertainty about them, and went upstairs. Around 5:30, she came back down and leaned in the kitchen doorway. "Are you staying for dinner?" she asked Claire. Claire looked at Ethan. He looked at the documents still spread across the table, the coffee cups that had been refilled twice, the specific, comfortable mess of people who had been working together long enough to stop performing tidiness. "That's up to your dad," Claire said. "Stay," he said. It came out simply because it was simple. "Okay," Claire said. Maya disappeared back upstairs. Claire looked at the table, at the documents, and then at Ethan with the expression that had been developing over the past weeks. Not guarded anymore, not careful, just present, just her, in a kitchen in Annapolis, with grease-stained documents and bad coffee and someone else's colored pencils on the counter. "We still need a name," she said. "I know. Any ideas?" He thought about Daniel talking about sailing to Maine, about the specific quality of certainty in his voice when he'd described a plan he hadn't told his wife about yet. He thought about the dog tags, warm from his skin through 2 winters. He thought about Maya saying, "You're good at doing the next thing, even when it's hard." "What about forward watch?" he said. "Not as in watching forward, as in someone keeping watch ahead of you, so you can keep moving." Claire looked at him. She didn't say anything for a moment, and in the particular way that silences between people could carry different weights, this one was full rather than empty. "Yes," she said. Just that. He got up to start dinner because it was 6 o'clock and Maya would be hungry and the chicken wasn't going to cook itself. And Claire stayed at the table and began organizing the documents into a stack with the careful precision of someone who'd found, without planning to, that someone else's kitchen table had become a place where things made sense. Outside, the Chesapeake was dark and cold, and doing what it always did in December, indifferent to everything except its own business. A boat somewhere on the water sounded its horn once. Low, brief, the sound traveling through the cold air as sounds did in winter, further than you expected. Ethan listened to it from the kitchen and didn't name what he felt, because he'd learned that some things stayed truer when you didn't rush to put a word on them. He cooked dinner, that was enough. The Forward Watch Foundation launched on a Thursday in late February, in a rented conference room in Annapolis that fit 40 people and held 53 because more had shown up than anyone had planned for. Ethan had not planned a speech. He had notes, half a page, handwritten, which he looked at once before the event started and then folded and put in his jacket pocket and didn't look at again. He'd found over the years that prepared remarks had a way of getting between you and what you were actually trying to say, and what he was trying to say was not complicated, even if it was hard. He stood at the front of the room and looked at the people who'd come. Veterans, mostly. Some of their families. A handful of people from the Naval Support Facility. Sandra Okafor in the second row, still slightly uncertain about why she was there, which Ethan intended to fix before the end of the afternoon. Admiral Carver on a video screen in the corner dialed in from Virginia because he'd said he wasn't missing this but also wasn't driving to Annapolis in February. Claire was standing at the back of the room. She'd been clear from the beginning that this was his event, his organization, his voice. She was the funding and the board chair. And she would be present but not central, which was a distinction she held to with the particular discipline of someone who understood that certain things were undermined by the wrong person being in front of them. He'd argued with her about it once. "You built this," he'd said. "I funded it," she said. "You built it. There's a difference, and you know there's a difference, so stop trying to give me credit I'm not entitled to." He'd stopped arguing. Now he stood at the front of the room and looked at the people who'd come on a Thursday afternoon in February because something had reached them, and he took a breath. "I'm going to keep this short," he said, "because I think most of you came to hear about what this program actually does, not to listen to me talk about why we built it." He paused. "But I'll say the why part first because I think it matters. I know what it's like to be the kid who stays home. My daughter Maya is 8 years old. Her mother died before she was 1. Every person in this room who has lost someone, or who grew up in a house where loss was the background noise, knows that what you need is rarely complicated. You need practical help. You need someone to know you exist and to show up without making you ask twice. And you need to know that what your family member did, whatever it cost, was worth something beyond a folded flag and a letter of condolence." He stopped. "That's what Forward Watch is going to do, practically, specifically, without a lot of ceremony." He looked at the room. "I'm not good at long speeches, so let's talk about what comes next." He sat down. The room was very quiet for a moment, and then it wasn't, and the afternoon moved into the practical work of explaining program structure and application processes and the specific kinds of support the foundation would provide in its first grant cycle. And Ethan moved through all of it with the same quality of focus he'd brought to every part of this project, not performing conviction, just having it. At the back of the room, Claire listened and thought about Daniel and found, to her own quiet surprise, that thinking about him here felt different than it had in years. Not less sad, but less like a wound and more like a fact she'd finally made her peace with carrying. Tate. Afterward, when the room had thinned to a dozen people lingering over bad coffee and printed program guides, Ethan found Sandra Okafor near the window looking at the Chesapeake, which was visible in a thin strip between buildings from this particular angle. "You doing okay?" he said. She turned. She was in her early 40s, with the watchful, precise quality of someone who spent her professional life looking at numbers that were supposed to add up and noticing when they didn't. "I'm not sure why I'm on the board," she said. It wasn't false modesty. She said it like a genuine question she wanted answered. "Because you saw something wrong and said something when you didn't have to," he said. "That's rarer than it should be, and it's the exact quality this board needs." He paused. "A foundation that's supposed to serve people who've been failed by institutions can't be run entirely by people who've never cost themselves anything by doing the right thing." She looked at him for a moment. "That's a very specific thing to say. I've had a lot of time to think about it." She nodded slowly, turning back to the window. "My father was in the army," she said. "He made it home. But I remember what it was like in the house during deployments, my mother not sleeping, the way she'd watch the news and then turn it off and then turn it back on." She paused. "There was no one who helped with that. We just managed." "That's exactly the gap," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. It had the quality of a decision being made rather than a conversation being concluded. "Good," he said, and meant it. The Callaway case resolved in March, which was faster than the federal timeline Priya sued had originally outlined and slower than Claire's patience would have preferred. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of money laundering and received a sentence that Claire's attorney described as appropriate and that Claire herself described privately and only to Ethan as insufficient but real. $12.4 million, she said. They were in the shop, a Tuesday evening, Maya at a friend's house for the first time in months because she'd finally established the kind of school friendships that generated invitations. The Chris-craft was nearly finished. In the particular slanted light of a March evening, it looked the way boats looked when you'd done the work correctly. Not flashy, just right. He gets 4 years in restitution he'll spend the next decade not fully paying. "What did you want?" Ethan asked. She thought about it honestly, which he'd learned was what she did when he asked her direct questions. She didn't reach for the first available answer. She actually went looking for the true one. "I wanted it to not have happened," she said. "Since that's not an option, I wanted something that felt proportionate to 22 months of deliberate, systematic betrayal by someone I trusted." She paused. 4 years probably is proportionate. I just don't feel it as proportionate yet. You will, he said. Not because it gets easier, just because you'll eventually stop measuring it against what you wanted and start measuring it against what was possible. She looked at him. You sound like you've done this before. I've had to make peace with outcomes I didn't choose more than once, he said. It doesn't get less hard. You just get better at knowing it's temporary. She looked at the boat. She's almost done, Claire said. 2 more weeks, maybe 3. What happens when she's done? I contact the owner. He comes to look at her. He writes me a check. He paused. And then I probably find another one. She smiled at that. Not the social function smile, not the tired almost smile. The real one, the one that had gotten easier to see over the past few months. Of course you do. The work doesn't stop because one boat is finished. No, she said, it doesn't. They were quiet for a moment in the shop, with the smell of varnish and salt air, and outside the March evening doing what March evenings in Annapolis did. Cold enough to be honest, light enough to be hopeful. I went to Daniel's memorial marker last week, she said. He didn't say anything. He'd known she'd started doing that. She'd mentioned it once, briefly, in the context of something else, and he'd understood it was not an invitation to discuss and had let it be hers. I hadn't been in almost 2 years, she said. I used to go and it felt like standing in front of a question I couldn't answer. Why and how and whether any of it meant anything, she paused. This time it felt different. Not resolved exactly, but I knew more than I knew before. I knew what he decided and why. I knew what he said. She looked at her hands. I talked to him for a while. Probably looked insane. Probably didn't, Ethan said. I told him about the foundation. She paused. I told him I was okay. He was very still. I think it might have been the first time I've said that and meant it, she said. I'm okay. Not healed, not done carrying it, not pretending it didn't happen. Just okay. Actually okay. She looked at him. I'm not sure I would have gotten there without all of this. He held her gaze. There was something in the air of the shop that he didn't try to categorize, just let be what it was. Daniel said you would be, he said. I know, she said. I'm starting to think he knew me better than I gave him credit for. He paid attention, Ethan said simply. He was good at that. She nodded, looked back at the boat. Forward Watch got its first application today, she said. A widow in Norfolk with 2 kids, 9 and 12. Her husband was a corpsman. She needs help with the older one's tuition for a technical program. I saw it. I flagged it for first review. I know. James forwarded me your notes. She paused. You approved it before you technically had approval authority. I have approval authority. It's in the governance documents. The governance documents say you have approval authority after the first board meeting, which is next week. Then I pre-approved it. She looked at him with the expression that had become one of his favorite of hers, the one that was simultaneously exasperated and not actually exasperated, the expression of someone who kept encountering someone else doing things the right way in the wrong sequence and finding it impossible to argue with the underlying judgment. Fine, she said. She should have the funding by Friday, he said. It'll be there by Friday. That was the thing about Claire, which he'd understood about her in the first real conversation they'd had, and which 6 months had only confirmed. She got there. Whatever distance she covered to get there, whatever resistance she put up in the interim, when it was right, she got there. She didn't need to be convinced of things that were right. She needed to be sure, and once she was sure, she moved without equivocation. He respected that more than almost anything else he'd encountered in a person. In April, the Chris Craft was finished. The owner, a cardiologist from Baltimore named Patterson, who'd bought the boat on impulse 15 months ago and immediately realized he'd underestimated the scope of the restoration, came on a Saturday morning and stood in front of her for a long time without saying anything. She was back in her original configuration, the white hull with the navy stripe running clean from bow to stern, the teak brightwork done properly, the hardware polished to the correct vintage finish rather than the showroom shine that would have looked wrong on a 1962 boat. God, Patterson said quietly. Ethan waited. She's exactly right, Patterson said. Yeah, Ethan said, she is. Patterson wrote the check. They shook hands. He came back the following Saturday with a trailer and took her home, and Ethan watched the boat that had lived in his shop for 14 months disappear down the street on its trailer, and he felt the thing he always felt when a finished boat left, a compound of satisfaction and loss, and the particular readiness for whatever came next that you only accessed when you'd completed something fully. He went back into the shop. Danny was sanding something on the work table, unhurried, with the earbuds that were his permanent accessory and that somehow didn't prevent him from knowing when he was needed. "Good," Danny said, pulling one earbud out. "Good," Ethan said. Danny put the earbud back in. Ethan stood in the empty space where the Chris Craft had been for a while, looking at the clean floor, the outline of where the sawhorses had sat. Then he went to the corkboard and looked at the job tickets. 3 boats waiting, 2 inquiries to follow up on, and a note from a man in Eastport with a 1970s Egg Harbor he was thinking about selling whole instead of restoring because it was more than he'd taken on. He'd look at the Egg Harbor. He wrote himself a reminder on the board and went to make coffee, and the day continued. Maya turned 8 in March. He made the cake himself, which was not one of his demonstrated competencies, and it came out leaning noticeably to one side. She decorated it with sprinkles arranged in a pattern that was supposed to be a boat, and they both agreed it looked more like a very colorful island, and they ate it anyway because it tasted fine and appearance wasn't everything. Claire came. She sat at the table with Maya's 2 school friends, and the neighbor who'd watched Maya on gala night, and Danny and his girlfriend, and she ate the imperfect cake and sang happy birthday with the slightly off-key quality of a person who sang rarely and wasn't going to apologize for it. And Maya opened her presents with the focused efficiency of a child with a clear idea of what she wanted and genuine delight in being surprised by what she got. After the friends went home and the table was mostly cleaned up, Maya sat next to Claire on the couch with the sketch pad she'd gotten as one of her presents and showed her the first drawing she'd done in it. A boat, obviously, but a good one, with actual proportion and a credible rendering of the rigging. "That's really good," Claire said. She said it the way she said things that were true, without filler, without the inflating quality of adult praise that kids could always detect as false. "I've been practicing," Maya said. "It shows." Maya considered this. "Claire," she said. "Yeah. Are you going to keep coming to Annapolis?" Claire looked at the drawing, then at Maya. "Yes," she said. "I think so." "Okay," Maya said, and went back to her drawing with the complete, unhesitating acceptance of a child who had asked what she needed to know and received a satisfactory answer. Ethan, washing dishes at the sink with his back to the room, heard the whole exchange and said nothing. Some moments you left alone because the moment knew what it was doing and didn't need your input. There are things you plan and things that happen to you, and things that are, in the end, some combination of both that you couldn't have predicted and couldn't have prevented and wouldn't undo even if you could. Ethan Mercer had been planning, at 35, to live the rest of his life in a clean, bounded way. The shop, Maya, the veterans' work, the occasional boat that was beyond saving and the more frequent boats that weren't. A life that had been stripped back by loss and then rebuilt with the materials that remained, which were fewer, but in some ways more honest than what had come before. He had not planned for a gala invitation that someone should have thrown in the recycling bin. He had not planned for the moment he looked up from a breadbasket and saw a woman across a ballroom register the sight of a dead man's dog tags with the particular stillness of someone who has just understood something terrible and true. He had not planned for any of what followed: the private dining room, the conference table, the shop, becoming a place where someone else came to put their hands on something real and work beside him in the good, uncomplicated silence of actual labor. The foundation, the cake, the drawing of a boat in a brand new sketch pad. He had made one promise 6 years ago, in a moment he hadn't chosen, and he had kept it imperfectly and late and in the most public possible way. And in keeping it, he had found, not redemption, he didn't deal in that particular currency, but something more ordinary and more durable than redemption. He had found that promises kept were not endpoints, they were openings. That was the thing about Daniel's final order, the thing Ethan had spent 6 years misreading. He had thought of the dog tags as a debt, something he owed, something he carried until he could put it down. He had been right that it was a debt. He had been wrong about what putting it down would feel like. It didn't feel like relief. It felt like arriving somewhere. He was not sure what he was arriving at. He was not going to try to name it prematurely. He had learned that the things you named too early had a way of becoming smaller than they were. What he knew was this, that the shop opened at 7 most mornings, and Danny was getting more reliable about punctuality, and Forward Watch had approved 11 applications in its first grant cycle and had 3 times as many in the second. And Maya was excelling at earth science despite her stated opinions about rocks, and the Egg Harbor in Eastport turned out to be worth restoring after all. What he knew was that some mornings, when he was walking the 8 blocks from his house to the shop in the early light, with the cold off the water and the seagulls doing their dissatisfied circuits over the dock, he felt something that he would not have known what to call a year ago. Not happiness exactly. He was suspicious of that word, suspicious of how often it got deployed to describe things that were more fragile than advertised, more like rightness. The specific, unspectacular sense of a life arranged in a way that fit. He wore the dog tags still. He'd thought, after everything, that he might retire them, put them somewhere safe, somewhere respectful, somewhere that acknowledged they'd served their purpose. He'd tried once, leaving them in the drawer beside his bed, and he'd made it to noon before he understood that taking them off wasn't the right ending to the story. They weren't a debt anymore. They weren't a burden. They were what they'd always been before they were anything else. A man's name, a man's blood type. The simplest possible evidence that someone had existed and shown up and decided what mattered. He wore them because Daniel would have thought the retirement was overly ceremonious. He wore them because they were light, and he'd long since stopped feeling their weight. He wore them because some things you carried not because you had to, but because you chose to, and because knowing the difference between those two things was maybe the most important thing he'd figured out in his entire adult life. Claire drove down from D.C. on a Friday evening in early May, the first warm Friday of the year, and they sat on his front porch with the paint still peeling and 2 cups of coffee that were both better than anything from the shop pot because she'd stopped at the good place downtown on her way in. The street was doing what streets did on warm May evenings. Kids somewhere down the block, someone mowing a lawn, the unhurried ambient noise of ordinary life going about its business. She'd had a hard week. She'd told him about it on the drive down, on the phone, in the blunt shorthand they'd developed. A difficult board meeting, a contract negotiation that had gone sideways, a decision she'd had to make that was correct and costly, and that she'd made without flinching and then spent the rest of the day second-guessing. He'd listened and asked the right questions and not told her she was fine, because she didn't need to be told she was fine. She needed to be heard by someone who wasn't going to try to fix it. Now she was just sitting, not processing out loud, not working through anything, just present on his peeling porch on a May evening with her shoes off because the boards were warm from the day's sun. "Danny painted the floor in the second bay today," Ethan said. "How does it look?" "About the same. It's a floor." "Did you tell him that?" "I told him it looked good, because for Danny, completing a task he said he'd complete, on the day he said he'd complete it, is genuinely notable progress and deserves acknowledgement." She smiled. "You're a better manager than you give yourself credit for." "I'm a passable one," he said, "which is different. Most people aren't passable ones. Passable is a higher bar than it sounds." He drank his coffee. Down the street, a kid on a bicycle did something ambitious and then reconsidered it. "How's the Norfolk family?" she asked. The Corman's widow, the first application Forward Watch had approved. "Her name is Deanna," he said. "I talked to her Tuesday. The older one starts his program in September. She said—" He paused. "She said she'd been trying to figure out how to tell him she couldn't make it work, and then the approval came through and she didn't have to have that conversation." He was quiet for a moment. "She said she'd been dreading that conversation for 3 months. Claire held her coffee cup in both hands. "Good," she said. The word was quiet and complete. 11 families in the first cycle, he said. 40-something in the pipeline for the second. "I know, I read your report. James said you read it 3 times. James talks too much." But she wasn't irritated. "I read it 3 times because it was worth reading 3 times. She looked at him. "You wrote it like a person who knows exactly what he's talking about and doesn't need you to be impressed." "I don't need anyone to be impressed. I know. That's part of what makes it readable." They sat in the quiet for a while. The evening was cooling at its edges, the way May evenings did in Maryland, warm in the sun and honest in the shade. "Ethan," she said, Yeah. She held his gaze in the easy, direct way she'd developed. Not searching, not guarded. Just looking at him the way people looked at each other when they'd stopped performing around each other and started simply being in the same place. Thank you, she said, for all of it. The gala, the conference room, the shop, the foundation. A pause. For staying. He looked back at her. You don't have to thank me for that, he said. I know I don't have to, she said. That's not why I'm doing it. He didn't say anything for a moment. He'd gotten better over the past months at letting things be said without immediately moving to deflect them or qualify them or put them somewhere manageable. Some things deserved to land where they landed. You're welcome, he said. She nodded, looked back at the street. Maya's voice came from inside the house. She was on the phone with one of her school friends. The conversation carrying the particular breathless speed of children relaying important information, and the sound of it came through the screen door and into the evening air and mixed with the noise of the street and the smell of someone's dinner from 2 houses down. Ordinary things. The whole inventory of an ordinary evening. Ethan sat on his peeling porch and drank his coffee and thought about a man who had wanted to sail to Maine, and about a promise that had taken 6 years to keep, and about the strange, unplannable way that one kept promise had become 11 families and 40-something applications, and a foundation with a name and a woman sitting on his porch with her shoes off on the first warm evening of the year. He didn't believe that things happened for reasons. He'd seen enough of how the world actually worked to be skeptical of that kind of architecture. But he did believe that what you did with what happened to you was yours. Fully, irreversibly yours. And that the choices you made in the worst moments were the truest measure of the kind of person you were going to be in all the moments after. Daniel had made his choice in the worst moment. Ethan had made his, not in the moment on the helicopter where he'd had no real choice at all, but in the years after, and in the gala that he'd almost skipped, and in the private dining room, and in the shop, and in every Thursday morning since when he'd gotten up and done the next thing, even when it was hard. Maya had said that. You're good at doing the next thing even when it's hard. She was 8 years old and she was right. He finished his coffee. The evening settled around the porch, comfortable and unhurried, asking nothing in particular from anyone sitting in it. That was enough. That was, in every way that actually counted, more than enough.